Mhm.
Everyone, this is Jack Wilson, a senior undergraduate sustainability science and society at Michigan Technological University, working in the social sciences, food system sustainability, and more broadly interested in sustainable community development. And as you can see by the pinned comment, we're talking about how communities can be more sustainable. And so,
Yeah.
saying before the stream cut off, sorry again, I think I figured it out, was how can communities do more sustainable action than, say, a statewide effort? So, floor is yours.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. When considering the question of sustainable action at different scales, we see that there are many different levels at which we can instigate change, from the personal level, the community level, the regional level, state level, federal level, and even global level. And I think it's really first important to understand that systemic change needs to happen at all of these levels, for ultimately what happens at a local level influences what happens at a global level, and vice versa. But, for a lot of people that don't work in the sustainability field or don't work in politics, it's really easy to feel powerless. I feel like these great challenges, like out again. Are you still there?
Yeah, you froze too. But,
Cool. But let's take waste, this example of waste, right? For a long time, people talked about these garbage patches in the ocean. They only mentioned the technological solutions, like what kind of technologies can we develop to clean up these issues, which is looking at the issue from a purely technocratic perspective. But if we consider that not only do we need to clean up these garbage patches, but we also need to slow our input of trash into the ocean, we see that these issues are deeply political, social, and cultural. And that, so in seeing that these environmental problems are ultimately a product of social phenomena, we can begin to address these issues at this kind of level, right? So it's interesting, in Michigan, where I live actually, because we have really bad gerrymandering in our state with the way elections go, we have a very Tea Party state legislature, despite being a generally blue state. And in 2016, the state of Michigan actually put a ban on banning plastic bags, right? Which is really, whenever I tell people this, they're kind of just confronted with confusion. I don't think you'll find it.
What was the precedent before? Like, were there plastic bans before?
I mean,
this is like a preemptive ban.
It was kind of a preemptive ban on banning plastic bags, which is really interesting. And I don't think that there were any constituents of the state of Michigan that really wanted that, but it's very clear that there were probably some corporate interests that wanted that. And so that's what happens. But, I think it's really important to understand that despite this law, there's still so much that the communities of Michigan can do to reduce their waste. And I think it's really important for people to understand that we shouldn't wait around for these politicians to come in and make these changes.
Right, continuing on Michigan politicians, if I may. I don't know if you saw, we posted about how Governor Whitmer tried to post some executive orders in the Republican House, I think, in the Michigan block that. So, that's interesting as well.
Yeah, and our political system is very corrupt, which is why I like to do this sustainability work at this community level, and especially in the context of climate change, with the recent reports that we have that we need to reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030. It's really hard to imagine in the current political system that the congressional legislature is going to implement these changes in such a short time period. And while I don't suggest that we abandon political activism for social and environmental change, I do think that we shouldn't wait around for the right candidates to come in and be our saviors, and that there's so much that we can do at the community level for developing stronger local food system, developing community-based renewable energy programs, developing community composting programs, developing gleaning programs to reduce food waste. If we look at our communities as like these systems and these flows of food and energy, we can start to see, the ways in which we as community members can come together and make system changes.
Or from the bottom up, grassroots organizations.
Yeah, grassroots. And I think that, just to touch on kind of this state, national, and global level, I think the most important thing that needs to happen is for us to develop a truly democratic society, because we know empirically that most Americans believe in climate change, and they believe that it's created by humans, but these voices are suppressed through our corrupt political economic system. And in a capitalist nation state such as our own, the more capital you have, the more political influence you have, which you can subsequently use to influence policy to benefit your own capital interests. And so I think a perfect factoid that displays this fact is that 9 of the last 10 presidential races were decided based on the candidate that was able to put the most money into their campaign. It's kind of a crazy fact. And we know that these campaign finance laws, the 1% systematically steal representatives from the control of their constituents. And we know that the Electoral College and gerrymandering are silencing millions of voices. So I think on that level, I think the most immediate reforms that need to happen are campaign finance, abolishing the Electoral College, abolishing gerrymandering, Citizens United so that corporations can't pose as individuals.
How these issues that might seem like far away are actually very relevant, like environmental peasant economics and social programs. And then, the Electoral College, that suppresses Democratic candidates who are more likely to vote for policies that attack climate change. And it's
exactly.
related. In 2016, the 5 candidates that got the most money from fossil fuel lobbyists all had a terrible environmental record. So, interesting how the environmental movement almost like unites these other movements that would seem to be very unrelated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what I have on that.
So then, it's important to have communities sustainable, but then what are some examples of sustainable efforts by communities?
So one of the more interesting community-based initiatives that some of the people in my department are actually working on is it's called a community solar program. And essentially, community solar involves the installation of a solar electricity system that is built in one central location in a community, and that communities can collectively come together and invest in this so that the costs and benefits are distributed across the voluntary investors who choose to subscribe and receive the credit based on the generation of energy. Because, buying solar for your own home, it's kind of a big risk. It's kind of a lot of money, and not everyone can afford it. But pooling together your resources as a community to come together and develop community renewable energy resources is actually a really good option for a lot of communities.
Just emotionally, the feeling that you know exactly where you're getting energy from, that you can go to where you get it from, the knowledge that you know exactly what's happening with your own power. It's kind of empowering. Just on a personal basis, it can be very powerful.
And it actually develops the resilience of our energy system, because our energy system is right now it's very centralized. We have a small number of whether there be coal-fired power plants or natural gas power that are in these places, and they're distributing energy to large spans of space. And through developing community-based renewable energy resources, communities can kind of develop energy autonomy from the larger conventional system. Now, I think the one downside to this is that it's really only available to more middle-income communities. So there's still a need for statewide systemic change so that everyone can have access to clean energy, because clean energy is also an environmental justice issue. A lot of low-income communities and communities of color, like in Michigan, like in Flint, and like in Detroit, a lot of these communities are disproportionately affected by these pollutants. And so I do think that it's also important to push for that statewide systemic change so that everyone can have access to clean energy.
Right.
Yeah, but this community-based solar program is a really awesome option for communities to start producing renewable energy right now because, I mean, as you guys know, time is running out.
Yeah, we don't have enough time anymore.
But another huge system in which we as individuals have a lot of influence in is the local food system, and this is one that I do a lot of research on. It's actually a lot of fun getting to work with communities on this. People are really passionate about local food. And so a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the oil and resources that we consume actually comes through our diet. And so, this is because the conventional industrial agricultural system is incredibly dependent on fossil fuels, from petroleum-based fertilizers that are creating the massive dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico to the tilling practices that are causing, much of the Midwest to lose as much as 60 tons of topsoil per acre per year, and these are really big problems. So supporting local farmers, supporting sustainable agriculture, gardening is a great way to fight climate change, and getting involved with community gardening efforts. One grant that I recently submitted actually was a garden matching program. So in some of the research on the local food system that I did last year around college campus, I found that a lot of students who stay in the summer have a hard time gardening because a lot of them live in rental houses, and it's in their lease agreements that they can't put in a garden. Sustainable development the concept of sustainability kind of has these two different components. So it has this component intergenerational equity and intra-generational equity. So intergenerational equity speaks to equity for the future generations, for the people to come, whereas intra-generational equity speaks to equity for everyone that's here now. And I think that this is something that I really stress, especially when talking about sustainable development and the sustainability movement, is that, who are we creating these sustainable systems for, right? Whose lives are we trying to sustain? Is it just the rich countries, or is it just the 1%, or is it everybody? So developing of justice and equity into our sustainable development programs is paramount to the success of these programs.
Like, some people might see environmentalism as a kind of upper middle class movement, like what you said with kids, but it's
Right.
with everybody, because everyone breathes the same air, so it's more than
Exactly, yeah.
So then we talked about some examples, but then how can, for people who really understand environmentalism, how can they be more sustainable in their community?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to just kind of, look at what's already happening in your community. Look at the organizations, if there are any organizations that are geared towards sustainable development, get involved. And if there aren't any, make some. I think we, all of us that are passionate about, the environment, environmental activism, we have friends that are too. I think a lot of people in our generation are passionate about these things and passionate about protecting our future. So finding people with those same interests and coming together and organizing and say, developing a community garden or developing a community composting program and going to city council and saying, hey, where can we find a place to have a community compost pile? And then going from there and developing a program like, okay, we have, 20 people in our community composting group. How can we, design this so that, say, it's based on volunteer hours. So how can we design the system so that it's easy for people to be involved, and so that one person can just take 1 hour a week and go in their neighborhood and collect compost from people and put it in the compost pile, and then someone else from the organization can do it tomorrow. So it's kind of coming together and pooling our time to invest in sustainable development.
Right, get everyone involved in the movement too.
Yeah, totally.
It's very expansive. There's a lot of people involved in grassroots movements.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you can recommend be very small, like you're going to garden your own home, and then have people see your garden, how successful it is, and then working together build a community garden. Would that be good for sustainability?
I mean, yeah, and it's definitely the cool thing about community gardens is that they're very open places, and they're places for learning. Like, a lot of people don't know how to garden. Some people didn't grow up with a garden, and so a community garden is a place where, here you have a bunch of people that are gardening together, and they have all these skills from doing this. And so I think that that's an awesome option. Also, gleaning programs are really cool. I'm sure, a lot of people hear about, all the food waste that happens in our society. I think 35 to 40% of the food that we produce, is wasted. And with some of my research in the local food system, where I am in the Eastern Upper Peninsula, did some interviews with just restaurateurs and chefs and stuff, and basically what they're saying was, we have so much food waste, but we just don't have the time to put it aside or to someone or to find a place for it. And so developing a program that will do that for restaurants or for grocery stores, that will collect their food waste and take it to a food pantry or take it to, places in the community and that need food. That's also
restaurants, and a lot of times it's cheaper to buy food in bulk restaurants. So people buy a lot of food, but you have to, and then I have to when I work in a restaurant, I have to scrape the excess food to the garbage. It just felt bad because it's wasting so much food, and there'd be homeless people in that community, and that food could have gone to them. Even if I could use the food, a compost pile in general. So definitely making more
exactly
to compost and educating people on how important it is will be critical.
Yeah, totally. Is that all you have for me, or?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Communities, a lot of times I do think that there's a stigma around environmentalism where it's like, oh, you have to buy a Tesla car and put solar panels in your house and like climate change, but really, it could be as simple as putting a garden in your front yard. And then
Exactly.
the community garden, every Saturday or Sunday you go there, socialize with people, talk about the week, have fun, and eat some good food. So it's sustainable. Really
and
go ahead.
and to touch on that, I think it's interesting that the way that the contemporary sustainability movement has kind of evolved. It's especially here, it's become very like an individualistic thing. Buy a Prius, get a reusable coffee mug, like get bulk food, but and then there's this kind of sense that once I make all these choices that are sustainable, that I can kind of absolve myself of the responsibility of protecting the environment. But we also have to understand that it's our privilege to drive a Tesla. It's our privilege to drive a Prius. It's our privilege to get organic, ethically grown, fair trade bananas. And so we also need to, as well as make those choices ourselves, we also need to fight for sustainable development in the community and at these larger regional and state levels that open these sustainable options up to everyone. And one of the things that we see in the conventional food system is these really long vertically integrated supply chain where a lot of the value is taken out between all these middle levels of processing and middle management and like these large corporations that are kind of funneling the value of these products. I was reading the other day that I think banana farmers in Central America receive around 3% of the total profits from the banana industry. Whereas we're on the other side of it, we're getting these super cheap bananas, but who knows how they're grown, who knows where they came from, who knows the amount of fossil fuels that were burned to get them to here, and so
that ties into environmental justice, health, environmentalism, economic trade. That example as well, because it shows that the environment does it's very wide scale of things. So.
Yeah, it's a very complex system, and so in developing a local food system, we completely shorten that supply chain to go to a farmer's market, and it's straight from farmer to consumer. And while some farmers markets, because of the way things are, some products are going to be more expensive than at, the store, but other products are going to be cheaper than at the store. But yeah, so also developing a local food system that is economically available to everyone is super important. But another thing about thinking about these big systems, right? I think it's really useful to think about things like climate change and biodiversity loss in the sustainability field. We think of them as these wicked problems, right? And in this way, we see them as there's not one linear causal factor that's creating these, but a really complex myriad of factors that's creating these huge issues. And so solving these issues need to be treated in this really complex way that attacks the issue from all these different angles, from driving a Tesla to gardening or whatever.
And also as simple as buying some $1-2 seeds. So
yeah, and seed saving, that's a great way to separate yourself from the large companies and whatnot. And here we have a seed swap, actually, where people who save their seeds at their garden or at their farm, they come together and they swap seeds and they give them to each other. And it's kind of it's a cool way to develop community resilience.
Isn't that forbidden against a lot of Monsanto products and stuff?
If they're GMOs. If they're not GMOs, it's fine. But yeah, so in the context of community gardening for the people of the apartment, and I think that is going home, maybe in the grocery store, but most of the time our cars are left sitting. One of the interesting, I mean, I think coming from this it's really interesting that the way that the contemporary sustainability movement has kind of evolved. It's especially here, it's become very like an individualistic thing. Buy a Prius, get a reusable coffee mug, like get bulk food, but and then there's this kind of sense that once I do that, once I make these choices that are sustainable, that I can kind of absolve myself of the responsibility of, protecting the environment. But we also have to understand that it's our privilege to drive a Tesla. It's our privilege to drive a Prius. It's our privilege to get, organic, ethically grown, fair trade bananas, and so we also need to, as well as make those choices ourselves, we also need to fight for sustainable development in the community and, at these larger regional and state levels that open these sustainable options up to everyone. And, one of the things that we see in the conventional food system is, these really long, vertically integrated supply chains where a lot of the value is taken out in all these middle levels of processing and middle management and, these large corporations that are kind of funneling the value of these products. I was reading the other day that I think banana farmers in Central America receive around 3% of the total profits from the banana industry. Whereas we're on the other side of it, we're getting these super cheap bananas, but who knows how they're grown, who knows where they came from, who knows the amount of fossil fuels that were burned to get them to here, and so
that ties into environmental justice, health, environmentalism, economic trade. I like that example as well because it shows that the environment does a wide scale of things. So.
Yeah, it's a very complex system, and helping a local food system, we completely shorten that supply chain to go to a farm market and it's straight from farmer to consumer, and while some farmers markets, because of the way things are, some products are going to be more expensive than at the store, but other products are going to be cheaper than at the store. But yeah, so also developing a local food system that is economically available to everyone is super important. But Another thing about, thinking about these big systems, right? I think it's really useful to think about things like climate change and biodiversity loss in the sustainability field. We think of them as these wicked problems, right? And in this way, we see them as, there's not one linear causal factor that's creating these, but a really complex myriad of factors that's creating these huge issues. And so solving these issues need to be treated in this, really complex way that attacks the issue from all these different angles, from, driving a Tesla to gardening or whatever,
And also, it starts as simple as buying some $1-2 seeds. So.
Yeah, and seed saving, that's a great way to separate yourself from, the large seed companies and whatnot. And here we have a seed swap, actually, where people who save their seeds, at their garden or at their farm, they come together and they swap seeds and they give them to each other. And it's kind of it's a cool way to develop community resilience.
Isn't that forbidden against a lot of Monsanto products and stuff?
If they're GMOs. If they're not GMOs, it's fine. But so in the context of GMOs, right, it's kind of like this, a lot of people, it's like this black-white thing, like people that, are super against GMOs or people that are super for GMOs, I think technology, and especially when thinking about, developing crops, that stuff is really cool. But the way that GMOs are used by corporations to subvert the economic autonomy of farmers, that's where I have the issue with GMOs. And so it's not this...
About living in an apartment, I touch on GMOs. I mentioned that they'd be good, but they're being used for bad. So we don't know.
Exactly.
We don't know what the effect of them are. We don't know if, say, the gene from a peanut is put into a gene for rice, and if someone with a peanut allergy ate that rice, they get an allergic reaction. Because GMO companies just don't tell us what happens. They don't allow research, I believe. I believe it's also against law under research. And they have to pay for seeds constantly, so it could be a good system, but we just don't know it. So it's trans, I forget the word, but be able to know what's happening. And we've got Is there anything to help while living in an apartment? So I'll let you take that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, just living in an apartment, you're already doing something. Because actually, a lot of people don't know this, but people who live in apartments actually use less resources than people who live in houses, because they're a part of that centralized heating and centralized cooling of a large building, as opposed to, housing 100 people in one large building is way more efficient than housing 100 people in 100 separate individual houses. So, I mean, just living in an apartment, you're already doing pretty good. But I mean, composting, what was that? Oh, yeah, absolutely. One of the apartment complexes that I've actually worked with in my research on the local food system here, they actually did implement a space for community gardening for the people of the apartment. And I think that is an amazing idea for if you live in an apartment and you want to garden.
How would you do that with the management, or how would you convince them to allow it?
Yeah, I mean, I think coming from this, I don't know, from this kind of sustainability background of like, I want to garden not only for, my own autonomy, but also because I want to be less dependent on the conventional food system, and I want to fight climate change. I think that's a great way to do that.
I'm glad we inspired you. Hopefully, you glean some information from this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go for it. Just you can get more people to go to the management. I assume that's better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these management and city council, you go to them, they want to help. And if you gather, the more people you get involved, the better, because they want to make their constituents happy. They're whoever happy. But to go back to this question of GMOs, I'd like to talk more broadly about technology in general. In this book I read recently about the philosophy of technology, there's this essay by a famous phenomenologist, Martin Heidegger. He talks about the way that things are inframed and how that affects their influence on society. So I think that the way that we enframe technologies has a huge influence on their subsequent, I guess, effects. So when thinking about, say, autonomous electric vehicles, about a year ago I did some social impact research on the implementation of autonomous electric vehicles. And one of the interesting things that I found in thinking about, from the sustainability perspective is most cars spend 95% of their life just sitting. Because, maybe you use it 20 minutes going to work in the morning, 20 minutes going home, maybe 20 minutes in the grocery store, but most of the time our cars are left sitting. And one of the interesting models that I came across was kind of this shared value model of autonomous vehicles, where a community, instead of every individual just buying their own autonomous vehicle, a community coming together, say a community of people, and buying 100, 200 autonomous vehicles, and then you have kind of like an Uber model of, say, I'm here, I need to go here, I pull up an app, autonomous vehicle comes up, picks me up, takes me where I need to go, and then they go and pick up the next person. So instead of 5,000 people buying their own individual autonomous electric vehicles, we can do the same amount of transportation with like 200 vehicles, which is way, way, way less resources. Right. And when we think about, overhauling our systems, overhauling the way that we do transportation, the way that we do energy, we also have all of the resources that go into that. And if we can limit the amount of resources that we use to do that transition, then we're back. So
if you have 5,000 electric cars with 5,000 people, then 1,000 gasoline cars with 5,000 people before you transition, then if you can't change each car to electric individually, whereas if you have maybe 100 electric vehicles or 10 or 100 regular vehicles or 10 regular buses, you can transition those to electricity, and electric cars more sustainable, easier than if it was decentralized. So
absolutely. Yeah.
Secondhand, right, buying off eBay and stuff, buying secondhand.
Yeah, and thrift stores. I try to buy most of my clothes at thrift stores. Mostly because it's way cheaper, but it's also using recycled materials. I think that's I think that's a fantastic idea. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's like kind of it's weird that this mental purity of a used car versus a new car. In reality, as long as it's not like older than 10 years, it should function fine. I mean, if you get a laptop that's old, it should function relatively fine. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
yeah.
That is pretty.
It is, and I think that it's a really important thing to think about when we're thinking about overhauling our technological systems. Can we limit the amount of resources that we use in doing so? And I think one interesting idea is actually reconfiguring the spatial arrangement of our communities and of our society. Like, why is it that I have to live 20 minutes away from where I work? And then, you dig into that and you see, well, okay, the housing prices and the property taxes here are more expensive here, so I have to live here, but I work here. But if we can redesign our communities so that, we can bike to work or we can walk to work, that would be even more ideal than overhauling our entire transportation system. And another thing, I think that in trying to figure out what kind of technology is ideal, I think that we have to look at the context of the community. So if you say for New York City, right, it actually makes more sense to just develop better and bigger public transportation than, say, to switch the transportation over to electric autonomous vehicles, because ultimately, you know, a subway is a more efficient way to transfer 100 people than 100 autonomous vehicles. So, yeah, I think in my research I found that implementation of autonomous vehicles works ideally in more suburban and rural areas. But yeah.
It's a good point, being able to watch your work. I think a lot of people do it. It's just, you know, the 4-year-old man midlife crisis thing for like this show. I think a lot of times it is cars for necessity. A lot of people don't have the time to walk to work. If it was closer, then, you know, we could eliminate that need. And I used to like a master plan suburban community that was only older than and I was able to walk to school every morning. Was able to walk to work every evening.
Wow.
And so I didn't need a so it took away
That's amazing.
the necessity part of it, so it's much easier.
Yeah. And, you know, another thing that's important to think about in, you know, doing this sustainable community development is how is this affecting the communities that are already here. So in some cases, like say some areas of San Francisco, there were, you know, these huge movements to make these communities more sustainable, and in the process, those communities were actually gentrified, and a lot of the people that lived there ended up having to move away, and because they couldn't afford, because all of the prices of everything were going up, because, you know, the area was becoming hip and sustainable. So it's also really to think about these issues of gentrification as well, because that's a huge issue in the sustainable community development field. Yeah.
Nice. Community electric vehicles.
Awesome.
Yeah. Maybe in the Green New Deal there'll be more funding for low cost transportation things like the Paris Metro and New York Subway.
Yeah, and I think the United States especially really needs to develop better public transportation. I mean, if you look at Europe, I mean, we're decades behind, and we have the technology. It's more, I think, the corporate interest of the large automotive industries, I think, that are influencing us.
For the Paris Metro, you get your euro, you put in a slot, you get a ticket, go through a turn thing, and then you go in the metro and go where you need to go. It's super simple with that.
Yeah.
And bringing that to the United States, making it easier for people to be sustainable, will definitely help communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially in Detroit, there's this one area where in the 30s this light rail, and Ford Motor Company actually covered up the light rail because they wanted people to be more dependent on the, and, you know, we see this in a lot of American history. And one of the more interesting things that we see when we look at, say, the development of the automobile in American society is that when it first came about, it actually reified a lot of issues of inequality, because people who were able to afford cars subsequently then had more spatial mobility and subsequently more economic opportunities, whereas people in communities that didn't have the resources to buy a car then had less economic opportunities. And I think that, especially in the context of autonomous vehicles, this is really important. How can we implement this technology so that it works for everybody?
Right. We want to create a self-fulfilling system. We want to create a positive feedback loop of helping the rich and the plastically more better off people, making them better off, and like creating more gap between the middle class and upper class. So I think it's interesting you brought that up. I never thought about that. Having cars allowed the rich to be more richer, to have more influence.
Yeah.
And poor people were just left behind.
Yeah, exactly.
I think in Paris it's like $1 per trip for transportation. So having that would create social mobility at a huge scale.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that you bring up Paris. You know, I don't know if you've seen the Paris protests that have been going on the last couple months, but I mean, the whole country has just been erupting. And, it's really interesting looking at the context of why. So Macron, I think at some point last year, he put some sort of ban on raising the taxes for rich people, right? And then he implemented this carbon tax, which was in accordance with the Paris Accord. But the issue is that it disproportionately affected lower middle income communities that lived outside Paris and had to commute into Paris to work. And so, there's this, since around 2012, there's been this kind of concept of green growth, which essentially posits that as long as we invest in technology and introduce the right incentives, that we'll be able to, avert, ecological catastrophe. Yeah, I'd just like to touch on this one last thing. The question comes up a lot, it's very controversial, but is capitalism conducive to sustainable development? And, it's a really interesting one. I think the biggest fundamental qualm that most academics have pointed out is the idea that in capitalism, we have this idea of limitless growth, right? You'll hear in business all the time, if you're either growing or you're dying, right? And this is fleshed out by the great systems thinker Donella Meadows in her famous publication, Limits to Growth, which she explains how the idea of limitless growth is actually antithetical to sustainable development in a system with limited resources. Now, yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the book, but it's Capitalism versus the Climate.
Oh yeah, Naomi Klein. She is fantastic. Absolutely, yeah. And so in the last 5 to 6 years, in response to this, a lot of policymakers have been pushing for this idea of green growth, right? Which was originally introduced by the UN Sustainable Development Conference in Rio in 2012, by the World Bank Organization, the Economic Cooperation and Development, and I think the UN Environment Program. But they all produced reports promoting green growth. And today, this is the core plank of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I think it's incorporated in goal number 8, which is decent work and economic growth. And, as I said, that, it essentially posits that as long as we introduce the right incentives and invest in the right technology, that we'll be able to keep growing without leaving a detrimental effect on the earth. And basically, in very theoretical terms, the idea is to decouple GDP from natural resource use. And while this is a very attractive solution, the fundamental problem is that there actually isn't any research that supports it, and that actually the current research that's been done since the 2012 Rio conference has said the exact opposite, that we really can't keep growing the economy if we can continue to use our resources, or we can't have economic growth and conserve our natural resources at the same time. They're antithetical.
More things to grow more. So
exactly.
Things eventually. So why not just make that transition better?
Right. Yeah.
This book to anyone watching, Capitalism versus Climate. Yes. Excellent book. It's very thick to everything. Nuclear power, coal, just capitalism in general. It goes into some neoliberal, dismissing some neoliberal ideas. So what Macron's doing about, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very good book.
Yeah, and I we see the logic of neoliberalism. We see it in the sustainability movement all over the place, and it's kind of really interesting. And I think that to go back to that point of thinking about the political economic system, I really want to stress that we really need to get money out of politics. Campaign finance reform is essential for climate change mitigation, because as long as the top 1% is controlling our representatives, we don't have a voice in the political system. So, yeah. And then, but in the meantime, our civic responsibilities go so far beyond just voting. Like, there's so much we can do between elections in our own communities to kind of kickstart this green transition. So, yeah.
It all starts with the community garden. So.
Yeah. I mean,
community garden to growing our political system. It's
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Cool.
It was great talking to you. It was great.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Like the individual people. And, we definitely have a voice. Like 1% may still have a voice, but we definitely do.
Mm-hmm.
We should vote with our hearts and our mind.
Mm-hmm.
Also take action in the meantime. Don't just wait every 2 years to do action.
Yeah, and I think that, a lot of people come from this place of really wanting to change the world. And, I came into college thinking the same thing. I wanted to change the world. But as I've been, working and getting more into sustainable development, I've been realizing that, I have the most power in changing what's around me, directly around me. And so I think, to use a metaphor, which I love garden metaphors, I think there's so much we can do in the garden that we can touch, in the community that's around us. So yeah.
Been a pleasure having you on the show. Hope to interview you.
Yeah, thanks. We'll have to do it again.
Anything to plug? Any your Instagram or any website, any events or anything?
You feel free to follow me on Instagram. I don't have anything to plug right now, but I will be I will have a paper that I'm trying to publish that I co-authored about my work in food system sustainability within the next couple of months. So I guess stay tuned for that.
As soon as you publish it, let us know when I'm on the show again. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Great day.
Cool.